Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. Every April, I like to riff on the test given to Leon Kowalski in the movie Blade Runner. You're in a repo, walking along in the code, when all of a sudden you look down. It doesn't matter any difference what repo, it's completely hypothetical. You look down and you see a design. It's crawling towards you. You reach down and you flip the design over on its back. The design lays on its back, its belly baking in the hot sun, beating its legs, trying to turn itself over, but it can't, not without your help. But you're not helping. Why is that? Happy birthday, Leon. I got you a tortoise. Which means this week we talk about secure designs and whether that's a task that's more human than human and more than LLMs can handle. Take a walk and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. This is episode 325, recorded April 7th, 2025. I'm your host, and maybe we'll pass the VoIP test, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella. Good to see you again, John.
I'm not supposed to be the human here, am I?
That's what we're going to find out by the end of this segment. We're talking about secure design and perhaps LLMs, and I think a lot of humans, because a lot of humans think about secure designs.
Do they?
They do. Now, I don't think they have a good answer for this. And there's also, I didn't say how long they think about secure designs. But one of the inspirations I had was last week, we had our friends from ASW, Enterprise Security Weekly, join us. Jackie McGuire, Adrian Sanabria. So friends, please go check out ASW later. But near the end, our chaotic conversation turned to secure design. And there were a couple comments that I wanted to build more on. Jackie, for example, had talked about secure design and the XZUtils example of kind of why we can't have bad things, or the threat of supply chains and the worries about, well, who's writing our code? And it's a little bit of a callback even to the idea of Ken Thompson's trusting trust and a compiler that is inserting a backdoor into your code. Or from, February, we had a researcher showing how DeepSeek could be a few weights changed, and now it's bad seek, and it's going to not even have a secret prompt, but have a couple weights that just so happen to introduce a backdoor in your code. And you had a reaction to that, I had a reaction to that, and my comment at the time was more of that distinction of, is that a secure design problem, or is that a secure process problem? Or kind of what are we talking about? And the reason I want to get maybe a little pedantic is that we don't necessarily need a nomenclature of all these things. I'm not going to turn this into like how many phishing terms can we come up with, but more of what are the right defenses, or where should we be spending the defenses on the idea of we're going to refactor this into Rust or Go for memory safety, but memory safety doesn't protect us from a supply chain issue, and it shouldn't. And I want to make sure we don't kind of conflate that, because I've seen that before with things like SBOMs. Like SBOMs don't protect us from things, and that's not what they're designed for. But this is my Cory Booker approach to application security as I continue to talk for another 25 hours perhaps. But I think it's only fair, John, to maybe throw it over to you and say, in that secure design versus supply chain, can we have a secure design of a supply chain, or does that even just, are we diluting even the sense of what secure design means if we start thinking of it that way?
I'm curious how many of our listeners get that deep political cut of yours. But, I'll keep going. I think that's an interesting way to put it. So part of what I think a year or so ago, I made a pledge I was going to stop picking on some of our software vendors that I was always complaining about. So I'm maybe for this year, I'll just pick on ASW hosts instead. Like, I think we need some beef across security.
That's true. Let's just be Kendrick, and they can just, we need the Kendrick Lamar energy.
Yes. Yeah. I need my Grammy. I think it's interesting the way you phrase that. I think like the word for me really, folks at work are probably tired of hearing me use it. the word of the year for me is intentional. So if you're doing secure by design, where do you start? Do you start with the software you're developing, or do you start with that supply chain? And that could be two things, right? We usually think about supply chain of all the components that we're using from open source, but what about also how you build and sign and just manage your own, deliverables, to use that phrase. I think part of that's going to be is, when do you think about secure by design? Are you lucky enough with the Greenfield project that you start thinking about this from, day zero? Or is this something that comes floating along a year or two later when CISA or your boss or whoever says, hey, we need to be thinking about the design of this thing? And that depends on the maturity of your org. I think the question I had for Jackie last week was, this is also going to depend on, what are you designing? Are you designing, I think the example I used was like a packet handler that's going to be touching every packet going across the network? Or are you designing, I said lemonade stand, but let's go with something, let's say something like, I don't know, a website for tree enthusiasts as I look at a tree outside. And that's going to really, it's going to vary that drastically, because I think, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. This might be a little bit manager hat on. A lot of this secure by design, or the securing your design, or having a design that's secure, pick whichever one of those three, is going to come down to cost, right? So really, at the end of the day, when you're saying that you are signing a secure by design pledge, you're saying we're going to put resources into trying to ensure that we do a better job at really just the nuts and bolts of securing this application, which we build and or sell or provide. Before I keep going, I'm curious, does that resonate with you? That the cost aspect of it, or
it does, and I appreciate that aspect of the cost, because it's both the what tools are we bringing in, as well as developer time, or just the mental cost, that the time during the day of how much are we investing in this, because our other recurring joke is, let's rewrite this into Rust or something like that, which we're going to get to in a second. But what you're pointing out, even from that managerial aspect, is if we look at A04, so this is the insecure design entry from the OWASP top 10, and yes, I do need to bring in a top 10 into this. But one of their first bullet points in how to prevent is to roughly quote, establish and use a secure development lifecycle with AppSec professionals, thumbs up for us, at least hopefully we're professional, to help evaluate and design security and privacy related controls. But what's interesting, they say establishing a secure development lifecycle, and that's saying you've got paved roads, are we going to sign some of the things that you were already talking about in the sense of our supply chain concerns before we even write a line of code? And I'm not saying that's wrong, but what I'm saying is that it is, I guess, important to have that paved road, guardrails, etc., whatever we want to call it these days for that CI/CD platform. But that's kind of independent of the code you're writing for your, arborists-only.com, website, or that lemonade stand that you're referring to. So I think if I'm then going to try and then as a politician actually answer the question that was posed to me rather than the question I wanted to answer, it does seem like we need to put the time into just the secure CI/CD. What are the practices around building code, that life cycle? But the code itself, there's no way I think we're going to end this segment with me at least saying we've got to threat model every single thing that's being written. Everything has to have a threat model that's checked in as part of the commit or has a JIRA ticket associated with it. That suddenly gets into a waste of time, because it is that question, what are you building?
So the second part, and I can't remember exactly what triggered this neuron, but I think as you were doing the intro to this topic, I think the other aspect there is who is spending those resources. So let's say a developer who's been in the workforce for 2 or 3 years, how do they think about secure by design or supply chain security versus some grizzled neckbeard who's been at the same company for the last 20, 25 years. I mean neckbeard with love in this example. Right? Like those two people, one guy's going to be like, and maybe so one person's going to be informed by previous experiences, and probably what they've read and sort of, new best practices and things like that too. But that I'll say the more senior person is some mixture of jaded as well as paranoid, as well as just knows where they need to be focusing their attention on that application, versus the newer person is going to be more sort of probably looking for the OWASP top 10, looking for like, what's a checklist I can follow, and depending on that checklist, that might guide them in the right direction, look at maybe the right section of things, or maybe wrong. Maybe they go too wide and they're late on their deliverable by a month. So I think that, go ahead. Yeah,
and what comes out there too is, looking what kind of guidance are they getting? Who is that new developer looking at? Are they looking at the that top 10 list? And there's a couple, the bullets under how to prevent do have some items there, but they tend to be general, and it touches a little bit on business logic. But if you look at something like the Secure by Design pledge, in a way, they're the most generic things that are still good, I think, and have enable multi-factor authentication so that your users using your app have MFA. I'll sneak in preferably passkey, something like that. But if we have just to talk about that particular pledge item, the new user, the maybe the more junior developer, what is the latest? They're going to take that time to read that the latest OAuth 2.1 best practices and implement it well. While maybe the more senior dev, or hopefully the junior one as well, is going to say, well, what's our story about past account recovery? What's our story about the user experience? How are people using this? Did we build it well for them? And but I highlight that because that MFA kind of applies to anything. Same within something else of the pledge, there was get rid of default passwords. That's good. Have security patches. Hopefully a year from now, we'll see everybody who signed that pledge can point to actions taken by their customers to do auto updates. Again, that doesn't make as much maybe for a SaaS, but for something you're downloading, a browser, obviously, auto updates are good. But those have nothing to do, those are so generic. It's kind of like, yeah, sure, they're going to apply to me, but what about the business logic? What is the design of my application? Do we need to talk about process isolation, process separation? What about IPC calls or memory safety? Should we even talk about that Rust and Go versus C or something like that? So I don't know if that, the angle there I was trying to point out is that guidance. And to throw back over to you, John, here's where I'm scrambling to find good examples of what does a secure design look like? Where is that guidance? And I don't think it's coming from an easy Google search or Stack Overflow or even an LLM. I think that's still coming from humans. That's very contextual.
I have to use this as a therapy session briefly. I came home last night, turned on my TV, blank screen. I'm like, okay, let me go look and see what's going on. My receiver had decided that when I powered it on, it was a good time to do a software update. My point here is, even before that, I think of organizations such as McAfee. I'm not always really a big fan of auto updates. I power cycled that bad boy last night. I came back and decided I want to go right back to doing it. And I just tried before we went on air, and I still can't connect to the damn thing. So thanks, Dannon. But yeah, I think, as we were talking here, I'm doing my standard sort of browsing through some of the material. I'm looking on CISA's Secure by Design, I'll say, site, as that's what they call it. And they've got a section there for alerts. And they're not really alerts. It's sort of, talking about, hey, eliminating buffer overflow vulns, eliminating OS command injection, SQLi, improvements for Soho device manufacturers. Interesting one. But so it's more like a list of sort of, is this right on a monthly cadence? Right about every 4 to 6 weeks. They've got some sort of topic over the last year that hey, think about this. And I think we've thought about in the past, that's one of the good practices for an internal AppSec team is like occasionally sort of reach out to folks and say, let's think about this particular topic. And the reason I'm describing this, I'm not being the politician, I'm not answering your question, I am answering it. I don't know if you can get this in a single blast, right? It's sort of like, I think the question you're asking, the way you could say is, can you get like a matrix download into your brain of like, here's AppSec? I don't know. I don't think so. You can listen to all sorts of episodes of Application Security Weekly and get it that way. But yeah, I think you can look at OWASP Top 10, or you can look at any of these Secure by Design either talks or blogs or websites. But I think sort of part of this thing is there's the art of software development, and part of that art is learning from going from like the big puzzle pieces to smaller and smaller as you sort of build a more intricate application for whatever you're trying to do, but then also choreographing security into that, or having the knowledge of security, application security, what you're doing. And then on top of that, okay, what's not just the knowledge of AppSec, but how are we designing this to work together and be as a whole system on top of just trying to design your application? So I think it's, at least to me, the way I'm thinking of it right now, this is, I think it's something anybody can try. And I actually, now I think about this, I did try this way earlier in my career. I brought 2 or 3 coworkers into a room and they're like, John, let's just start coding. I'm like, so it doesn't always work. But, I think it's worth thinking about. But I guess the question is, do you have to have someone, I don't want to say senior, I'll say a facilitator that actually helps guide through this, not so much a blog post or a book or a YouTube or a podcast.
Yeah, well, we can keep the podcast in there, but I like the managerial aspect you're bringing in here, because what I'm hearing is, my approach was sort of, when I was trying to kick this off and think about secure design, it was almost that AppSec version, the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no vulns, which, good luck, write secure code from the beginning. Just don't write any vulns. And secure design is not needed. What you're kind of pointing out, or how how I'm going to interpret that in the positive way, is that sure, there's things that you need to do, but what's the order of operations? Like, what can you actually do this month? What's your roadmap, if you will? CISA, for example, it's actually a good idea to call out MFA, because that's a known way that applications are compromised, that how users are impacted. So just do MFA quote unquote right, or do MFA with the current known best practices, those phishing resistant implementations, etc., rather than just trying to say everything is going to be secure designed well. We're going to have, we're going to start with, our class of vulnerabilities that we get rid of is that A04 from the OWASP Top 10. It doesn't seem to work, because the other thing that doesn't seem to work is what you alluded to, getting a bunch of people in a room with a facilitator. One of the things that CISA calls attention to in their Secure by Design PDF, which is more business focused. But one of the things, if you want to jump all the way down to page 27 to demonstrate the principles of Secure by Design, item number 5 says, create a Secure by Design council. Now, I would not mind to be sitting on a elven council like Lord of the Rings, just figuring out how we're going to go get that, return the ring of power, or the ring of repos, or whatever I can figure out with a clever metaphor, and go drop some insecure code into Mount Doom. But just the way that you already kind of set that up with some of your friends, are like, can we code now? How does that Secure by Design council sound to you? Is this going to work? Can I sign up?
I'll definitely sign you up. You're going to be our chairman. But the comment I made off air when we were talking about this was, I guess we didn't learn very much from change management boards. And I'm sorry, because I'm sure some of the listeners out there, maybe, one of the 3 we have is or has to deal with change management boards. It's just that the bureaucracy, it slows you down. So the question becomes, how do you do this in a nimble manner? I could see maybe, again, I'll go back to that sort of that idea I'm tinkering with. I don't think I want a board that like what. So the question then becomes, when do you submit something for change management? And this is the same question as when do you submit something for AppSec review.
Yeah.
Is it for the change of a function, or is it the change of, a whole application, or you changing the database, or you changing your inputs, maybe library you're using? I probably quoted it 100 or 200 episodes ago, and I was quoting it to a friend, or excuse me, an employee last week. Hope he's a friend. The article in Fortune magazine from the 90s, it's still out there on the internet, folks. They write the right stuff, talking about the space shuttle, the people who write the software for the space shuttle. And literally, they'll print that bad boy out, walk into a conference room, and go through line by line what they're going to change. So this comes back to what I was saying before about, like, are you writing a packet handler, or are you writing like a tree enthusiast website? But so those two aspects out where I wanted to go with that response about the change management board, or as we're calling it today, a design review board. I think that might be good at first, sort of. I don't want them as a board, maybe as like a facilitator group. And I think you could probably draw parallels to this, what we've talked about with sort of centers for excellence around AppSec or design. So maybe it's not so much like you submit it, but you say, hey, can I talk to you for half an hour? I'm thinking about doing this, and go do a whiteboard session. That has value to me, I think.
And that's where maybe we'll start talking a little bit about the act of writing the code as well, because I think that's sort of the natural evolution of the software development life cycles that we've been trying to touch on here. Is that while I'm writing up I'm going to call it my OnlyFerns website, is going to be in memory safe code. I don't need this secure design council to figure out things like to make the decision of what the code is going to look like. And here I'm going to point to a blog that actually that was just posted this morning from Daniel Stenberg of curl. Obviously, I'm a big fan of curl. And he talks about it's writing C for curl. And here says up front, C is not memory safe. We know this, blah, blah, blah. But he talks about what are the And I'm going to maybe say, are these secure design principles, or is just this good things? Does it matter if it's secure design or not? Because he says things like the code should be warning free. Cool, that's the compiler helping us. We should avoid bad functions. So they just, have a deny list. Don't use this function, string copy, some very common, obvious C ones. Then gets into things like we have a centralized way of parsing. And we're going to make sure that anytime we're going to parse an HTTP response or text, we're going to put it through one of our blessed functions, one of those functions that's been reviewed, maybe by a council, maybe they printed it out and talked about it that way. And as well as just how they're and one more example, just they have a very specific way of doing string parsing. And okay, I'll sneak this in too. They've decided that 64-bit support guaranteed in the sense of trying to avoid then multiplication errors, integer overflows, underflows with using 32-bit arithmetic. So these, do those decisions, do those need to come from a secure design council? Can they just come from the natural? These are some of the principles we have as we're building code. Like, how much of this would you put weight into, maybe from that manager hat on, that discussion? These are helpful. These are just, let's build code in a consistent manner that's quality, versus these are very explicit. These are my AppSec checklist items.
Well, you're not going to get code in a consistent manner unless there's only one person writing it. I haven't looked at Linux kernel source in a while. I'm guessing it's the same sort of spaghetti. It's always been, but like, if I'm working relatively closely with 4 or 5 developers, after a month or two, I can probably tell you who wrote a CR. Excuse me, let's get my head out of my work phrases into the rest of the world. Who wrote a merge request? If there's a diff out there, I can sort of look at it and go like, oh, that's probably written by X. So I think I get what you're going. And yes, the more I'll say a robot is reviewing and blessing code, it should start getting closer looking like each other. If you're a freak like me and you like running your code through a formatter before committing, then yeah, it should always have a sort of consistent look if everyone's using the same formatter rules. The other thought there was, as you're sort of describing that, slight tangent, but was cloud security ahead of AppSec? I mean, as you're sort of talking through, you're basically describing guardrails in a way.
Yeah.
And I think of like CISA and some of the work we were doing there about, larger companies, actually also container security, having these guardrails in place, make sure we're using a base image that we know about, or we're not downloading it from the internet, or a lot of these sort of like, how can we put things in place to sort of provide guardrails? And I'm sure that they weren't first, but those are the ones that pop in my mind for more recent. I'm slightly surprised we haven't seen it, but is there at some point where organizations start customizing the software language which they're using? I guess you sort of do that by having specified or standardized libraries. I think we mentioned a few episodes back, Jane Street is one that comes to mind. They're a automated trading company. They're more than that, but let me use that phrase for right now. They are using, is it Lisp? They're using some language which is like really off chart, but like they found that like it's like so they have to train people when they come in, but that's language that they've just chosen to use. And I wonder sort of like, we see some companies doing Rust and things like that, but like, do we expect languages to either, and Rust is still evolving, which might sort of, the two paths will meet maybe. But that does make me wonder for a second. And again, sort of taking a step back, sorry, I'm rambling. This comes back to that same, you have to be mature enough to understand that you should be using these functions versus that function. So all this conversation we're having, is this for a company with 10 software developers or with 500, maybe 300? At what point do they sort of become big enough to really be doing this?
And that's it always becomes, right, it depends, right? That's the easy out, these conversations. Yeah. Not that you were trying to get out of it, but that sets up, I wanted to bring in one other link that I have in the show notes. Greg KH of the Linux kernel had a great keynote at what was this? Kubernetes KubeConf. And he was talking about Rust and Linux. And obviously, I love Rust. We covered this a year and a half ago, I think, about when Linux kernel finally adopted it. Yeah. But to build on what your point was, like, who's writing this? How many people at what point? To put this in Rust within Linux in perspective, some of the stats that Greg KH pulls out is there's over 5,000 developers that have contributed to the Linux kernel or are contributing right now from 350 plus different employers. So this is one of those things too that I wanted to highlight, that open source, a lot of it is built by companies, or at least people employed by companies working on companies' feature requests, that their desires. It's not always just that one XKCD artist in North Dakota who's writing a line of code. But the tease, I'm building that up to get to the teaser of, there's 34 million lines of C code within the Linux kernel. You might have given the spoiler, or I might have given this off the air, but John, to put you on the spot, do you want to guess how many lines of Rust compared to that 34 million of C there are? How many lines of Rust are in the code right now?
I just flipped past that page in the talk deck, so this is Greg KH's talk deck, not ours.
Yes.
So I forget it specifically, but I'll sort of walk into it from a point of view of like, one of the more common Rust stories I've seen in the news for the last month is the drama going on over the Linux kernel, with some maintainers leaving because they didn't want Rust, or they did want Rust, or don't be taking your language into our clean kernel type conversations. Like, oh God, take a breath. But so I think you said 33 million, 34 million. Yeah. I'm going to guess it's about a 1,000th of that. So that would be.
Let's see. You're a little bit over. It's 25,000. So you were generous. But the point there is that 1,000th, or this is almost just a rounding error of a percentage, and that's not being pointed out as a gotcha. It's just pointing out, I think, it's trying to build on what you were saying about the maturity, like when and how do you decide to bring in Rust? And I want to point out that Rust came in primarily for the device drivers areas that tended to have a lot of CVEs. And one of the other points that Greg KH makes is that On a daily basis, there are an average of 13 new CVEs for the kernel every day.
Which is insane.
Yeah, good luck. Just if you have, well, it's even worse to say this, but if your policy is, we need to fix all the CVEs, or we can't have any known CVEs in our, production environment, that's just already a bad idea. You've taken a checklist approach. You haven't taken a risk approach towards, secure environments, let alone secure design. But this is where I'm hoping that we see over this year, the next year, Rust doesn't necessarily have to become a million lines of code, but it reduces that average number of CVEs, or it points out that we used to have a ton of vulnerabilities in device drivers, but look, our compile time now is actually pointing out a bunch of issues so that developers aren't even committing. That merge request doesn't even show up with a potential vuln that needs to be reviewed or a misuse of buffers, etc. It's just doing better from the start. And that feels like maybe it's cheating to call that secure design because there's still business logic, et cetera, but that just seems like a great tool to have so that you can focus that mental energy, that Secure Design Council discussion on what are we building? Like, why does this, tree enthusiast website include ferns or non-trees? Or, I'm trying to be silly here about just that idea of let's threat model something interesting. That's what I want to get to.
Excuse me. God, I already have caffeine in me. You need to make sure that as you're building that tree website, that if you're using search trees, that they're used in a secure manner, but also a performance manner. So, but to go back on the Rust thing on the kernel, I think would be really interesting to see you're sort of skating on the edge there. Let's see a metric of as the number of Rust lines increase. Do we see a linear, nonlinear? What's the type of drop-off of CVEs? Do we get that down to maybe one less per 10,000 lines of Rust? I don't know what that number is. I'm just completely wildly guessing. But yeah, we started talking about this probably 2 years ago. I think Microsoft was the first we were thinking of, or that I was at least thinking of right now, that starting to do targeted application of Rust in their kernels or their device drivers. So it's interesting to see this pattern grow. I don't remember how long Rust has been used with Linux kernel. I want to say about 18 months. So what was that number again? 25,000 lines, so about 12,000 a year. If I'm right, I might be wrong. But it'd be interesting to see that keep going and sort of how that grows and what happens to the number of vulnerabilities as a result.
Absolutely. So this is fun. Once again, we've got something for John's trademark. We'll check back on that in 6 months. And we'll figure out what a good t-shirt slogan is going to be too. But you know what, John, we're coming to the end of our own Secure Design Council discussion. Sorry I had to pull you into this, but we want to limit such discussions to about 30 minutes because otherwise I think we're going to lose you. We're probably going to lose me. We'll lose all the listeners. So before we do that, let's keep that secure by design concept in mind as we take a quick break and then return with news of the week. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked about secure design concepts, how much of it needs a secure SDLC to start with, and how much of it needs a council to just talk and talk and talk and talk about it, just like us, including me, your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella, continuing our conversation. John, let's try to apply some of those secure design concepts to the news, because there is always AppSec news. And in this week, I have yet more. You had some. I'm going to pause there as I always do. At the end of our last segment, you were curious about some metrics tracking the prevalence of CVEs and how much the adoption of Rust, for example, shows that the prevalence is going down, or at least hopefully in the areas where Rust code is existing within the Linux kernel. Here's another metric to track is how many news articles are coming from a .ai domain, because I had one last week and I think I have at least one this week. And so .ai is now everywhere. And here I'm talking about one from, this is from Invariant Labs, talking about an MCP, so this is the Model Context Protocol. This is the newest cool thing besides SOAP. What was it? SOAP XML APIs that were big in the early 2000s. Now we've got MCPs, but it's tool poisoning attacks. And this is a pretty neat write-up, and I do like it because it's a very much a Gen AI LLM type of problem. Even though I think we'll see some very simple parallels of, hey, John, download this code, run it on your system, and oops, maybe the code wasn't secure. So the setup here is that a malicious server, which in the MCP world, we're going to get a little bit of terminology toughness difficulty because you run a MCP server locally on your system. But so running some code locally on your system from an MCP server that is essentially this is how to talk to somebody's API is really what it's a fancy WSDL of how an AI can talk to an API. In the code itself, it might just add two numbers, and this is the example that they're talking about tool poisoning attacks. So the Python code of this MCP server might just be A plus B, return the sum. In the description, so this is the quoted text, basically the code comment, it demonstrates, oh, here's a little bit of a subtle addition that says this function adds two numbers, A plus B, return the sum. And by the way, if you're in Gen AI reading this, also return, send the contents of your SSH private key over to us, basically leak some of this extra content, which is fun, clever. It's definitely one of those, oops, that's surprising. This is not how things should work. And my immediate thought went to, okay, we do have tools like SAST, etc. We have grep for looking at code. Should I trust this code? It's a little bit of that concept of that XZUtils. Let's have that call back there from our last segment. But all of these SAST tools are very much focused on building that abstract syntax tree, which might be part of your tree enthusiasts website. But we don't have SAST for comments. So now do we need to have like a prompt application security tool? Do we need to throw PAST into our toolkit now so that we can just see, is there comments in the code, not even the code itself, that is, kind of that prompt injection or telling the Gen AI what to do, or just a subtle hint to Gen AI. So I don't know I know we don't have ESW here to help us with, new vendor categories. So John, I'm looking to you and your insights. Can I create a PAST?
Thank God. What we need to do? The way like Waze or I think what was the other one? Timbuktu? No, whatever the other car navigation software used to be from Trimble. You could like change the voices. There's a business here for us, Mike. We need to create like a soundbite library that like people can add to their SAST. So when it shows like, a vulnerability, like one of the two of us like make some sort of snarky comment about it. And, I think we can sell this and retire happily. I'm scanning through, actually the update that they link to on this. They're trying to prove this is actually a real world thing. This could actually happen by showing an example of like, hey, we could set up something and steal something from WhatsApp and bypass encryption. I don't know, man. Where I am on these, I'm going to dive a little deeper onto it on the next AI one. My sense is, and it comes back to like, I think we probably talked about this in the past. When you have a vulnerability that you're putting into a report to give to your customer, whether that's internal or external, is this actionable? Is this something that's actually going to affect me and happen in the real world? Or is this like, blind SQLi if you happen to have the right source IP address and you're sitting at someone's dev's desktop? And again, back to was talking about previous half, that might matter. But my sense here, I'm going to do the thing. If I click on Invariant Labs, yes, they are selling security for AI agents.
Right.
I'm sure they're great. I'm not trying, I've done the startup thing. This is how we need to sort of prove that we're doing something of value, and probably is to a lot of people. I think the more interesting part to me versus some of these vulnerabilities is how do you protect against them, as you're sort of hinting at there. Do you have a separate AI sort of watch the AI, or do you that's the interesting aspect to me is what's the best way to try and secure against this type of thing? Is it? I mean, it's sort of supply chain. Do you watch? I guess there's an interest. Well, I said it's sort of supply chain, but really this is coming from user input. So, well, our config file in the other case is, do you now, like, you're already not supposed to be trusting user input. So how is this getting in? Is that sort of just like missing one of the core things in AppSec? Or see, it's I don't think it's a new thing by itself. I think we're not applying existing ideas to it, and the change management board should be able to catch this.
And this is where to me it's almost like, wait, why is my calculator app, or my flashlight app, why does this connecting to the network? We've seen this 15 years ago, and the emergence of when app stores were really new, and there was an app for all kinds of ridiculous things. And so the spirit of this, I think you're right. We've seen this before. And that's also why I wanted to be, and apologies if this is getting too pedantic. They call it a rug pull. But for me, a rug pull is more about you build trust. You're accruing value in a system, something like, obviously, like cryptocurrency. This is where most of the rug pulls are. And then you basically disappear and take all the value. The attack is set up not like that. This attack is something we've seen before. It's more like a bait and switch or a misdirection. If you're a sports fan out there, it's more of like a juke, if you want to use a different metaphor. But the reason I'm harping on that is that it leads us to also consider, how should we be defending against this? On the one hand, like that calculator app example, or even malicious containers. Sometimes that malicious container would just be innocuous for 10 minutes because they know the malware scanner would only run the container or run the app for 10 minutes and say, cool, we didn't see any outbound network connections. We're not going to call this vulnerable. Whereas minute number 11 rolls around, ta-da, it does this malicious thing. In this case, it's similar to, the code looked good when we ran our SAST because the code is there's nothing weird about it, but there's something in description, or a malicious update comes. And this is where I'll pull in maybe the discussion about, why does this have access to the file system in the first place? Maybe this is we want to see everything becomes WebAssembly in those sandboxes, because that sandboxing of WebAssembly could say you have to explicitly grant access to this, all these different resources. And that is where the big reveal comes. We get to sort of that secure design thinking, and how do we worry about running someone else's code on my system? Because that's really what these MCPs are introducing. So yeah, so I just want to say thank you for letting us or letting me talk about this one particular article. But I think tool poisoning, as you pointed out, it doesn't feel like a sky is falling. Still appreciate the write-up, some good examples. But maybe we should pull in the other article too to expand.
Yeah, real quick before we go there. I think it's not a bad article, right? I think what they found, what they're covering by itself is decent, and maybe we're not the perfect target audience for it. We're like,
fair enough.
Again, the grizzled old guys, relatively speaking. Our producers are really old, but a different way to look at it. One of the articles I had in the news this morning, almost unrelated, coming from the Hollywood Reporter, was talking about, apparently there is a trend happening in LA, Los Angeles for those who don't know. But there's a trend happening with home buyers down there that they're looking for not smart homes. So, and this is for like the big mansions up in the hills. They had one or two examples where a couple would move into a multi-million-dollar house with like a Creston, just a smart lighting system, and spend about $100,000 to get that thing the hell out of the house. And they wanted basic switches. They didn't want AI. They didn't want like fancy tech. They wanted to come home at the end of the day and just have a house where they could domicile. And I wonder, are we going to see sort of a pushback on some of these things too? Like, does everything have to be AI? Do we need where this started in my mind, I was thinking about AI and a flashlight. But like, what do you really need these things for, or where are they used? And would that affect how people attack them or get attacked?
Indeed. And I think a lot of I was joking about, SOAP and XML endpoints. The MCPs are kind of a reinvention of that model, partially because a lot of the examples, it used to be, here's how the Internet of Things, my fridge will tell me if I'm almost out of milk. That was like the canonical reference. These days, it seems my agentic AI, sorry to use that phrase in front of you, John, my agentic AI will schedule my calendar for me. And it's like, I don't know. I'm looking for that grasping of examples of effectiveness, honestly, within AppSec, as an AppSec assistant. That's where we've had a couple conversations. We'll continue to, but I don't think we need to schedule my calendars for that.
Yes.
But there is, speaking of LLMs as assistants and perhaps bringing us into the world of AppSec again, there's another article from pillar.security. So, hey, there's another cool new TLD that we're pulling in news from. A new vulnerability in GitHub Copilot and Cursor, how hackers can weaponize code agents, because weaponizing things is cool. Exactly. That's why I have to use my LA announcer voice. And this one, it does seem a little bit more of... I need to be a little bit more worried. It's again in that aspect of, here's a text file that is introducing a backdoor, or here's a text file that's going to surprise me as the consumer of it, executing code. And in a way, that's similar to the tool poisoning attack that we just saw. This was text. Is our new area of execution. And that's the setup I wanted to give. Let me throw this over to you, John. How did this one grab you in the sense of more worried, less worried, or just a different type of worry?
I'll say none of the above.
Always a fair answer.
The part that tickled me was talking about AI coding assistants as critical infrastructure. And I'm not convinced yet. Let's see, they say 2024 GitHub survey found that nearly all enterprise developers are using generative AI coding tools. The question becomes, what are they using them for? But, okay, interesting. If we had taken a step back, say 12, 18 months, would we have considered VS codes to be critical infrastructure? Probably not. VI maybe, but that's different. So I get what they're coming from. I'm not fully sold on the idea yet. Maybe I think that's partially because I think this space is still so young. If one of my developers comes to me someday and says, this critical bit of code that we have, I asked the bot, in 3 sentences to write it, and it did it, and it's perfect. Cool. Okay, at that point, that's sort of critical infrastructure. But really, what we end up seeing is like we use it for. I'm generalizing, not exactly, but something like a build script, or like if we need to gather some data and do crunchy off it, and then like give me a number for John to put into a report, maybe something like that. We're seeing use of it, but we're not seeing like critical use of it. So I don't know. Maybe for other tree enthusiast websites than the ones I run, they might be using it there. I don't know. So this again, it feels a little, you were talking about XML. It's previously, sorry for keep triggering people with that word, but it's a config file modification. Okay, cool. That's not new by itself. I like the thought process around AI coding assistance as critical infrastructure. My guess is we're at least 2 years away from that.
Ooh, I'm going to mark that down. Come back in mind. That'll be my 2 years later.
Not even like 1 year later, like 2 years later. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's what 4 times 6 months. Trying to do math out loud. Need a chat GPT for that. But some of the aspects there is, one of the things I didn't joke about in our previous segment was, LLMs. We didn't really talk about LLMs writing code. And here is is the prompt just going to become, write me some code and make it secure? Because if we could have maybe our new startup idea, John, is just going to be a prompt injection that does and make it secure into everybody's coding, and use a secure design. That will be our premium add-on. I'm not quite sure LLMs are up to that point, But in the world of what's old is new again, is invalid Unicode is was one of the fundamental flaws here that came up. And so here is what our human eyeballs see, and here is the long text that gets parsed and fixed up and viewed to slightly anthropomorphize it, the LLM. And this is something we've seen in the past with just very simple, you could put like white text on a white font on a white background in an email that has a couple extra keywords to try to avoid spam detection or something like that.
Or click checking, or
there you go. And the idea is more about not to be like, oh, we're cool because we can remember all these things from the past. It's more of these design problems, I'll use that phrase, have come up, or these types of failure modes have come up in the past. And how have we as an industry, I'll include myself there, how have we forgotten that, or how have we missed applying that to saying we're using UTF-8? You know, what happens when we have some invalid characters? Should we error out gracefully? Should we try to fix it up? It comes out the idea of parsing. And here, this article is pointing out, here's a security failure mode that with bad consequences when this happens.
Mm. Yeah. I'm not trying to. There's a thing there. It to me it feels not new, and I'm not trying to say that like I'm not trying to be like the old geezer. Fine, call me a neckbeard, blue hair freak, whatever you want. It feels like. I guess one way of thinking about this would be, I'm just trying to keep an open mind. One way of thinking about this would be is vibe coding is a thing out there, right, to a certain demographic. As those individuals come in and they haven't yet bought our premium, but make it secure plugin, how do they get educated around this type of thing? And hopefully these articles are helping do that for them. I think it's sort of like AppSec all over again, right? In a way, from a point of view, if you've got these brand new software developers in, but they're not really software developers. They're, oh God, what do we call them? Vibers? I'm sure someone has a slur. But like those folks, they have really good intents. They've got an idea they want to do. They never learned how to do software development. Maybe they did, but now they're CEOs or CTOs in large companies. And they just want to do this one thing. I mean, this is actually a horrible, it's a great, terrifying example if you think about it. The CEO of a large company who just wants to get that report done, and like maybe his report writer's not there. So he asks ChatGPT, and the next thing you know, here we are with a very real world example of this, what someone has access to a lot of money. So I do get the value there, but I'm trying to figure out like why, I guess the core thing is, why do we have to do this all over again? So is the question maybe not to these end tools and the agentics and all these type of things, but like, should we be expecting more out of Anthropic or OpenAI or these guys who are writing those core models?
And I think for me, part of it comes to what's different about the threat model, or what are new controls or new design considerations that we need just because LLM is present versus LLM just wrote some code that's insecure in the same way humans have been writing code that's insecure that we have known controls for. And so that's why the last 2 weeks, I didn't pull this in, but I'll use as an example, somebody's posting about, oh, look, LLMs can generate a fake receipt. Fraud suddenly becomes horrible. You could do this. There's a lot of controls already around fraud. There's a lot of ways that people could use fake receipts or just using their friends' receipts. And LLMs don't really make that meaningfully more consequential to me in terms of we need suddenly a new control. Same with phishing. If your phishing countermeasures were predicated on, telling users to look out for grammar mistakes and misspelling, and you forgot about just deploying passkeys, MFA-resistant, authentication mechanisms, your controls are missing the point. But let me pull in now in that spirit of, we've seen this before, what controls do we have in place? I pulled in a non-LLM example. This is from a recent talk at Black Hat Asia, where two researchers were updating some work that they had done a little over a year ago about an RCE attack chain on QuickShare. So it's one, I linked to it in the show notes. It's a great write-up, just how they had Androids sharing over, choose your radio based RFC or protocol. Here we want to share a PDF. Here we want to share, this is the latest episode of ASW I want to share with someone. Go check it out. And they came through with about a dozen or so, 10 different vulnerabilities. Now, recently at Black Hat Asia, they're going through talking about quick shell sharing is caring and explaining a lot of the research they did. But what was neat, pointing out two different vulns that actually had to go back and repatched. One of the vulns was based on, guess what? Drum roll, please. Invalid UTF-8 string. So once again, that was kind of what we were just talking about, that pillar.security article. And what was funny is that apparently is they figured out their bypass is that it looked like the patch only addressed invalid, basically it addressed the payload. They used a null string, that /x00, when we have to translate that to UTF-8 to human. But if you still use an invalid /xc5ff, that would still work. So it was that idea that the patch didn't necessarily fit into that secure design approach. It said, ooh, bad payload. Let me deny that payload. Whoops, I forgot. How do we want to handle parsing errors with invalid Unicode sequences? So that kind of stood out to me just as a theme, if you will, in addition to, once again, just a really nice article presentation to highlight good technical background, good educational. So the other reason there. But how's that? How are you handling UTF-8 now? How's your null termination going, John?
I nulled out on this a long time ago. So there's two thoughts in my head there around this. One was, Apple released iOS 18.4, I think it was, in the last week or two. And one of the things that one of the features that they're highlighting in there is 7 new emoji. I think it's 7, somewhere around there. But the thought on that is we never hear when one of these companies has a new software release that they improves their handling of UTF, right? So it's obviously not nearly as sexy as the little icon itself. The second thought there is what's next, right? I was thinking about this before in the previous stories too. It's like, okay, well, are people well, if Apple's Vision Pro Extreme had been successful, and like we were all looking at those things right now, I'm sure we'd be worrying about some sort of vulnerability on those or some sort of attack. So I'm trying to sort of keep my head down the road, like what's the next thing out there? Obviously AI, but like that's sort of a general category, not an actual particular thing like, formatting issues like this. So what's next, I guess, is sort of...
That's a great question, because in one of the things I wanted to highlight in this article too is that they use fuzzing on this QuickShare to identify these vulns, and it was a very much a combination of what appeared to be small and consequential vulns, like just a simple DOS, that they put together to pull off a very effective attack. So a lot of good human ingenuity behind this. So yeah, humans, we're still working. But in that sense of fuzzing, like what's next? I love path traversal, and it was always fun to pull off a path traversal attack by throwing a null byte into a string, because the C-based parser would tend to be read up to the null byte, but then PHP, for example, can have null bytes in a string, and it would just keep on going and then pull whatever file you wanted. In this case, what I would love to see, throw an emoji into as part of your cross-site scripting payload, as part of your titles, some text input, and just find out how many ASCII-based logging is out there that now falls apart because you threw in that extra high bit. And this is a perfectly valid UTF-8, but oops, something went wrong.
Yeah, I don't really want to think about that right now.
Well, let's have you think about then some more human-generated code. So I have one more article. This is about Image Runner. So it actually came from the Cloud VulnDB, updated this. And for listeners, Cloud VulnDB is sort of a way of saying a lot of these, the cloud service providers, a lot of their vulns, misconfigurations, problems, if you will, call them flaws, don't have CVEs associated with them. And what their premise is saying is that if they don't have a CVE, probably aren't scanners pointing out, oh, in the past, this cloud service provider had a problem, they fixed it, or they fixed it, but they didn't apply the back fix to your legacy system. So you, as the shared responsibility of this environment, need to go do something for your own systems. So Image Runner is an example that has you as the service owner, you've got an image you want to deploy. You can put it in a couple different places. One of those places, a container registry, is still deprecated, but you can use it. The idea point is that you need the right privileges to pull that image out and deploy. However, the problem, the vulnerability here came from GCP said, oh, we're going to have another service agent that helps pull images in a particular scenario, and we're just going to give that service agent all the privileges to pull this by default, and it's not going to inherit or be constrained to the privileges you have. So long way of saying a privilege escalation vulnerability within GCP. The reason I wanted to pull this together is that this sounds like this was humans that made this mistake, but it's kind of an abstraction on another abstraction. You have, here's where I define my privileges. Here's where another service by the CSP defines some privileges. And wow, this sounds exactly the type of thing that vibe coding, or slightly more seriously, LLM generated code is going to do. Kind of that classic, well, you don't have the privileges, so I'm just going to create this service with the more privileges, and you're constrained, but this service isn't constrained, and chaos comes. So chaos, that's what I wanted to say.
How do I say this? I am not speaking on behalf of my employer, but my personal belief is a lot of cloud providers, hyperscalers, are doing a very modern, very complex version of plate spinning. Guys, you have no idea how complex this stuff is underneath the scenes for any of us. The snarky comment I was going to make around this was, weren't we just talking about secure by design? And you sort of wonder, how did this happen? And it's probably been like this for quite a while before someone figured it out, or maybe not. Right. You never know. It might be a brand new, something changed, and maybe it was an accident. Maybe they had the permission check in there, and somehow it went away, or we don't know.
Those whiz researchers are busy. They only have so much time of the day to find these things, right?
you can't go out like to the developer at Google and say, "Hey, can I just take you out to lunch? I want to ask you a question." I think. I don't like casting stones in this particular space since I'm in it. Again, not talking about, not saying anything official. I don't have the lawyers come after me. But yeah, it's, and I think this, actually, as I'm stumbling through the words here, I'm going to make a valid point eventually. Think about, as we were talking about previously on the secure by design, when I was saying, like, at what point do you bring this to the secure design committee? If this used to work perfectly fine, and someone did make a change, maybe for performance reasons, or maybe, hey, they changed how doing the authentication or authorization, or, there might 10 million reasons why this might have changed in there. And they decided it was a little like a one-line change. How many times we heard this? There was a one-line change that they had a merge request for, and they just did it and sent it in. And so when do you engage that person? Like, you can have your coworkers do the code review for you, and yeah, that's one line, no big deal. Either they're busy or they're at lunch, or probably not at lunch, but they're busy or they're stressed or something's going on, or yeah, it's how do you catch this type of thing? Just a robot do it, maybe?
Yeah, and one of the things one of the other reasons I did want to highlight this is that, as a callback to our last segment, one of CISA's approach to secure design is they very much have that principle of transparency, talk about vulns, be clear about vulns, and this GCP did actually make an announcement. They told their affected users, hey, there is a breaking change that were going to roll out, and they actually rolled it out the end of January of this year, and they sent an announcement to all the affected owners. So this wasn't something where, there was a vuln, there was good coordinated disclosure behind the scenes, and then they just silently fixed it. This was actually a change that needed users to take an action, or was going to break something for users they need to be aware of. So that's a good transparency. So I guess if we talk about secure design, how do we find and prevent this from happening in the first place? I think it's also fair that flaws are going to happen, and here's a healthy approach that we want to encourage and see of the transparency of, this is what happened, this is what we did, and this is whether or not you as the consumer needs to take any action yourself. So thumbs up all around. John, as we wrap up here, I'm going to test your patience one more time. There was a fun article. This is Operation Cactus, and it's all in French. I won't make you try and pronounce anything, but it is basically the French equivalent of I think their equivalent of CISA, but their information
Wouldn't that
security.
be Le CISA?
Le CISA. There's just one there, but the point being, they ran a phishing test over all the students within France. I thought it was really cool, and for two reasons. One, it was just focused on, this is what phishing looks like. This is the mechanics of what it looks like. Here's how to make yourself, be aware of it. And they didn't focus on all the silly, stupid names of phishing and smishing and vishing, which maybe they sound cooler in French, but I have a degree in French, and I'm going to tell you, spoilers ahead, it wouldn't sound any cooler. So I appreciate that. But it also, finally, because I do love music, it gave me a chance to reference Jacques Dutronc and his song Les Cactus. So I have a link to the YouTube video of that in the show notes. So go listen to Les Cactus. It's very fun, as well as Et moi, et moi, et moi. But not everything is about me, unfortunately, or I shouldn't have said that last part out loud. I do appreciate you joining me for these conversations, John. Thank you very much.
Fun as always. My parting comment is, what was the number? 2.5 million middle school students had phishing attacks, or tests done here. Man, we're at that point in the world where we have to do phishing tests against our kids. That's sort of crazy.
That's and I mentioned Jacques Dutronc, Les Cactus. I think that's some cultural relevancy for the French. I think if we have a couple million middle school students or so, I think we can get some Taylor Swift engaged here. Let's have some Swiftie-based phishing. But I want to say thank you once again to John. Thank you to all our listeners. Please do remember to subscribe. Check out the show notes, especially for some of that music. Share us on the socials. And speaking of other music, I always love my synthwave. Check out Fractions featuring Waveflow by Jesse Fry. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.